Blood satellite.
I'm so glad we put toilet talk in the script for this episode.
Toilet talk or sink. Like I've done this on my sinks too, where it's like just stuff and just I pull out darkness.
Nice.
So that's what you got to do. But like your house, I shudder to think of what is lurking in the pipes.
Yeah, me too.
You got civilizations lurking in there.
Yeah, probably. It's a whole season of Doctor Who down in my pipes.
It's a whole season of Doctor Who. Oh, that's a good one. Speaking of civilizations, let's talk about this book I read. That's not a very good.
Yes.
Maybe
No, that was good. That was good.
It could be one of my all-time worst segues. Look, we didn't have to talk about that fucking Russian non-coup. Isn't that cool?
Nice.
Which actually might have served this discussion. This is building off of what we talked about in the last few episodes, which were mainly about heartland theory. And prior to that, we were discussing the geopolitical realities living in Canada, infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party and the triads. And carrying on that path, there's a book I read that takes a modern approach to geopolitics. It's not locked in the 20th century or the 19th century. It's a more of a modern geopolitical reality that I don't agree with completely. I don't agree. Some of the books we cover here on out, I don't agree with their models 100%. But there's enough truth in them that I think we can extract it and work with it with what we talk about. Because, heartland theory, like we talked about the past few episodes, some people who subscribe to heartland theory think that explains everything, all geopolitical events. And I don't. But I do think it exists, and I do think it's relevant. Similarly, this book, titled The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel P. Huntington. It takes a bit of a broader approach. And so the arguments he makes, I don't agree with all of them, but there's a lot of truth in here. And I think it will resonate a lot with our audience. So the idea central to this book is that it was written in 1996, first of all. So there's a lot that's happened since then. I don't know if there was a newer edition. The one I got was one of the original ones from 1996. So, it's difficult to explain to people who haven't lived through it how much 9/11 changed everything. But there's a lot of like pre 9/11 stuff he's talking about here that is still relevant to this day. So one thing he says, like the center of the book, is that we're almost living in a post-nationalist world in the late 20th century, early 21st century. And I think we feel that a bit more now than ever before. But even back then, he was talking about this. And he was saying that, like, in this new world, it's cultural and civilizational identities which define the primary conflicts rather than class or ideology. Class or ideology were sort of 19th and 20th century ideas.
At one point, you had clashes between different medieval lords. At another time in history, you had clashes between European kings. At a third time, you had clashes between the people and nobles in the 18th and 19th century, those revolutions. You had clashes between different ideologies in the 20th century. The question for us moving into the 21st century is not can we overcome clash, but what type of clashes will exist in the world in the 21st century? And the answer that Samuel Huntington gives is what he calls the clash of civilizations.
To the point where people with differing ideologies will actually come together over shared culture on the international stage. So it's more like civilizational. And by civilizational identity, what do I mean? I mean, when people say the West or the East or the Middle East, these are sort of very, very broad amalgamations of identities.
Countries pull together and cooperate when fighting for a shared ideology, for instance, in times of war. But Huntington believed that cultural differences are more pervasive than ideology. He thought that cultural separations persist, and therefore these differences will be a perpetual source of recurring conflict. He applies this theory to the alliances and antagonisms that were formed during and after the Cold War, and in doing so, raises some controversial questions about the driver of conflict.
It's difficult when I speak to a lot of Europeans, in the past, and certain Europeans now, they don't understand this thing. They don't understand why you say white or black or Asian. And a lot of Europeans, there's no white. There's British. There's Anglo. There's German. There's Scandinavian. But this idea of white, why do you guys use white? No one in the real world uses white. But I'm like, well, they do if you're in a multicultural situation. So, and this is something that many Europeans are living through now as multiculturalism visits them. They see that their ethnic identities are gathering in ways that they didn't think they would. But in America, for example, it's a very distinct lived reality to fall on black versus white versus Asian lines. And people are correct in saying, look, the Chinese don't like the Japanese, and the Japanese don't like the Koreans. It's like, but if you are a Korean, a Japanese person, a Chinese person in a room filled with black and white people, you're going to cluster on the same side of the room. That's just lived reality. It seems to geopolitically shake out, geographically shake out, and in your lived reality, you understand that if these people, Jamaicans and Haitians and African Americans, they have a certain shared identity once they are put up against other identities in a multicultural situation. It just seems to happen organically. There's something important to that. And the only reason it didn't happen previously was because this multicultural experiment had never really emerged like this until the 20th century.
The world is becoming a smaller place. The interactions between peoples of different civilizations are increasing. These increasing interactions will, I believe, intensify civilization consciousness and awareness of differences between civilizations and commonalities within civilization. North African immigration to France generated hostility among Frenchmen, as well as at the same time an increased receptivity to immigration by good European Catholic Poles. Americans react far more negatively to Japanese investment here than to the larger investments from Canada and European countries. The interactions among peoples of different civilizations thus enhance the civilization consciousness of people, which in turn reinvigorates traditional differences and animosities stretching back into history.
And he said that, after World War II, there was a bunch of competing theories for how geopolitics shook out. There was 4 main ones, he said. There was offensive realism, which we had talked about before with Mearsheimer and whatnot. Then there was sort of ethnic lines. Then there was this sort of idea of it's the West versus the rest of the world. But in this model, he's he kind of combines it all. It kind of combines ethnicity and race and geography into the civilizational model. And what's interesting is that later in the book, he actually uses the term demographics is destiny. So even back in the mid-90s, we hear that a lot now, but in the mid-90s, you could still be like a liberal type guy and say demographics is destiny. Now that's only something us right-wing weirdos say. But back then, it seemed obvious to everyone. It's like, well, in a multicultural situation, the more populous identity is obviously going to run the show. Now you can't really say that, but back then you could. And he was saying that in relation to migration between Islam, the Muslim world, and Europe, and Mexico versus the U.S. So imagine back then saying, look, guys, demographics is destiny in relationship to Mexican immigration and being a lib. That was a different time. And the way he describes a civilization, so an example of civilization would be the West, the Western civilization. And the way he describes it, I've never heard it described like this before, but I like it a lot. He says, civilization is the largest we that we can feel culturally at home. Now, that is something that's always sort of negotiated. Like, how broad can Western civilization be? Does it include Spain? It doesn't seem to include Russia. Does Western civilization include Scandinavia? Maybe some parts wouldn't. It's something that kind of changes over time, but people do have a sense And people do have a sense that, even though North America is the West, Mexico doesn't seem to be part of the West, does it? Like that, you don't need to really explain to people before they get that. They get that Mexico is not part of the West. And it could be racial, it could be geographic, but there's just something there that everyone knows it. And people are like, oh, and the European Union knows this too. As liberal as they want to be, they know that Turkey isn't really Western yet. And whether or not people say it openly, these are the discussions that are actually happening between statesmen and between the most, secular liberal countries in the world. They understand, at least on some level, that there is an ethnic, cultural component to this that no one's allowed to talk about. And that's why, Turkey's kept on the fringes, frankly. And he says, civilizations, they can be large or they can be small. A civilization could be as large as China, or it could be as small as, he describes the Anglophone Caribbean, and it's, comes in all shapes and sizes. He says there have been 12, and this is where some people might disagree. There is some debate about this, but he says there's been 12 major civilizations through history. The Mesopotamian, the Egyptian, the Classical, the Byzantine, the Middle American, the Andean. Then there's the current ones, which are Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Islamic is kind of a collective one, Western, and Latin American would be sort of the one that's emerged not even that long ago, to be honest, because there was a time when Latin America was just seen as this backwater, but now it's being spoken of almost as like a civilization that's starting to form. And that, to be honest, like that's one of the, if I don't get to this later, I'm going to say it now, to give some people something to think about. Is like the future, like we all agree there is such a thing as like the Western Empire. Even if Europeans don't want to agree, it's like, well, China seems to think there is. Russia seems to think there is. The Middle East seems to think, like the whole world understands that there's this thing called the Western Empire. Some people call it the Atlanticists. Some people call it as the Greater American Empire. But whatever. There is this idea that it's America, Canada, North America, and then Europe, the American sphere of influence, which is, the kind of Western Anglo sphere of influence, right? And the question is, how much can they absorb? And is there a future where South America becomes truly and fully part of the Western Empire? Some people say it's on its way there right now. But, the question you ask yourself is, well, okay, what is Latin America? What is South America? Interestingly enough, like it can trace its roots back to Spain. Spain is pretty European. And he makes a point in the book. He's like, like Spain could have been a world power. Like if Spain wanted to, it could have really been like the America to South America. But he said like it spent more time trying to become part of the Western Empire, completely relinquished its control over Latin America, and it just became its own thing. But you have to ask, like, is there a pathway where South America is truly culturally, psychologically, ethnically absorbed into the Western Empire? And what does that look like? Now, my belief is that will essentially signal the end of white rule in the Western Empire. And and I mean that in not as like here's a dissident right doomsaying thing. I'm like, no. Like, I honestly think like if you incorporate the economic and geographical and resource power of South America into the Western Empire with its current control over trade and everything, like white people are pretty much done at that point. Because would you agree to that?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't thought much about it, but it isn't a nice thought. I wouldn't advocate for that happening, certainly.
Yeah, and one thing that people might notice, there's no African civilization. True. He says like most scholars don't really give Africa a great civilization. At various points, Ethiopia could have been one, because some people say, Ethiopia, not really. South Africa isn't an empire. There was never really a truly great civilization there either.
And Ethiopia was so heavily influenced by early Islam and early Christianity, and like trade and relationships with the Arab empires, and it's I don't know. It's like they're African, but even if they had a civilization, I don't think you'd call Ethiopia at its peak, which would have been maybe 1,000 years ago. Like you wouldn't call that an African civilization.
Yeah, and he made a point is like if there was ever to be a one in the running for, it would have centered around South Africa, and would have been just like the white part. But a lot of people, if you're black, you'd probably say, oh, all the great civilizations were African, but really, they'll say like, oh, the richest man in the world is African, but not civilization, because to be a civilization, like you need to have like a strong. We talked about this last episode with a core area. What is a core area? Like everyone kind of knows that France is a core area. It's an area, not necessarily the biggest area, not even necessarily the most populous area, but a nation or a region that is so culturally and militarily and ethnically united that it can project power over the areas around it. And it can kind of, and it's just almost like a metaphysical thing. Like France, even though it goes through so many changes, France still exists. There's still like the spirit of France, and it's still powerful. Like, he makes a point, like, look at Germany. Look how crippled Germany is, right? Look at how compromised Germany is. Look at, the whole world seems bent on smashing Germany to smithereens. Yet the idea and the spirit and the memory of Germany still sits high in the cycle of, go to fucking China and ask them about Germany. They're going to speak about the Germanic people with reverence, I promise you, despite fucking whatever Angela Merkel did to them. But like, there's still this thing called Germany that's still like almost ontological. And that's kind of what he's trying to grapple at with here. You can kind of switch out a lot of the materialist things, but there's still something that remains. He makes a point in here that really doesn't have anything to do with anything else that I'm going to talk about, but it got me thinking, and I'm going to just mention it here. He said that all ideologies are projects of Western intellectualism, which we've covered that on the show before, like anarchism, liberalism, communism, Marxism, fascism. All this stuff kind of comes from the Western world. They didn't just organically get generated in the East. But he says they were projects of the West, but the West has never really generated a single religion. Not in the true sense that we would talk about Christianity or Islam or even Buddhism. And he makes a point in the book that actually Buddhism would never count as its own civilization because, and I never considered this, but he said it never took dominance in its, like, the country where it was created or something. Like Buddhism has always been this kind of free floating thing, but it never was actually like a core power in a sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, but it makes you think like, the West has never generated a religion. It's kind of tried, but even the religions seem ideological, like Mormonism to me. I look at Mormonism, like it doesn't feel like a religion. It feels like just a version of Christianity that's more about like for a certain type of white person. It didn't come from that deeper level. It's almost religion by way of ideology. And that has nothing to do with anything I'm going to say. I just thought that's something to think about. Although some people would say, oh, the European religion would be paganism. Yeah, I know. But, not compared to Confucianism.
But that would be the exception that proves the rule, though, because all of the ideologies and like the success and the global empires that we created as Westerners came after paganism was wiped out by Christianity.
Yeah.
Right. So
you're right. Yeah. And there's on the topic of scale, he's got a part here where he says, in a globalized world, civilizational consciousness maximizes and stops at the level of noteworthy civilization. So that's kind of interesting. And so it's like, there is this thing like the African civilization, quote unquote, will be like an entire continent, but the Chinese civilization is so strong it's just one country. And the France civilization, it's an even smaller country. But there is sort of like we talked about last time, like a line of optimum conquest. And the story of Russia from the last episode is like how much can the entire Russian imperialism period was like a negotiation to how big can Russia be and still remain Russia. And in the sense, this is the story of every empire that's ever fallen. Once the empire really expands past its ability to, consolidate its internal forces, it kind of falls apart. So it's like, can Russia expand past the Slavic world? Not really tried. It tried getting in the Middle East, but just the forces of the world pushed it back, because might be able to take it, but you can't maintain it, And I think that's what you see with the European Union. Like, who should be let in? We won't talk about, but does the European Union make sense with certain countries on the edges involved, or would it stop being internally consistent? That's, again, a very broad way of looking at it, but that's the conversation that they're having right now. It'll be cloaked in policy and things, but that's essentially what they're talking about. Let me just read a part here. Oh, and also a big thing he talks about in this is that if you start going down this road, you would start thinking, oh, is it possible that all civilizations will become one grand civilization? And he doesn't say that at all. He says, no. That the existence of these civilizations almost seems to imply that there never can be one universal civilization.
So the United States, the argument is made,
Yes.
best recognize this in its own interest. That's first. That this is the way the new world is shaping up.
This is the way in which it seems to be shaping.
Whatever we
Yes,
said about
yeah.
a new world order,
Yeah.
it hasn't evolved the way we thought it might be.
Well, certainly the euphoria which existed in 1989 after the Berlin Wall came down has disappeared. And I think there were great hopes at that time that we were entering a new world order, that this is going to be a world in which Western ideas of liberal democracy and capitalism would sweep across the world, and that a new era of harmony would emerge. Well, that hasn't happened. And history hasn't ended. It's in many respects been renewed in a very dramatic and often rather brutal fashion.
You're using another author's notion.
Oh,
It
that's
is
right.
that Fukuyama said that history had ended because the West had won
That's
the
right.
great battle.
That's right.
And there was
The
no,
ideological battle.
The ideological battle, and there was nothing else to do.
Yeah,
Therefore,
well,
history was
basically,
over.
that was what Frank Fukuyama was saying, yeah.
And he, in reviewing your book in the Wall Street Journal, took issue with, obviously...
well,
If we follow this model, the expansions of they expand as far as they possibly can. And most of the wars are between the fact that they literally can't expand anymore. They're always like bumping up against each other. So to act like it's just this, we're all evolving in the same direction. It's like, no, we're evolving to the maximum size that we can be. And it seems that at a certain point, you either have to you kind of just destroy or absorb each other. And that's what, wars of conquest are about. We'll get into that a bit next episode, but that's why, imperialism is kind of inevitable once you get big enough. Interestingly, he calls the belief of a universal civilization, he calls it Davos culture. He says the belief of a universal civilization only exists in 1% of the world. So, it's funny that he said Davos there. So these will be the Klaus Schwabs. These will be the World Economic Forum. These would be the types of people that we talk about on the show, the elites, the globalist elites. They're the only ones that believe in a universalist society. And to this day, they're still talking about it. So it was just kind of I know they've been talking about this for decades, but it was funny to see back in 1996, he's still saying these motherfuckers at the World Economic Forum, they think we could have a one world government. And they're just still fucking doing it. Now, he makes a point in here. Again, this doesn't really have a lot to do with the rest of it, but it's such an interesting point that really changed how I looked at it. He said, English became the dominant language almost because it became de-ethnicized and it became indigenized wherever it was used. So it almost had this idea, there was a quote in here that said the true fall of the West was when the West started losing its Europeanness. And he's making the claim that the trade-off for English becoming sort of the global language, it's not really, but it kind of is, we all kind of know it is, was that by necessity, English had to become less European. It had to become this sort of patois that everyone uses. And so by engaging in this cultural imperialism, you almost doomed the Europeanness of the thing you were exporting. You kind of make Europeanness something everyone can participate in, which eventually turns back on you. Now, again, this has nothing to do with what else I was going to say, but I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at it. Like the deal with the devil you make for global influence is you lose some essence of yourself, or like by globalizing your like through imperialism, you globalize yourself. You know what I mean? by engaging in that, so it almost seems inevitable. Um, Now, there's this theory called Herodianism. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it was coined by this guy named Toynbee. It was this belief, and this was sort of the core of Davos culture, of this universalist civilization, one world government stuff. It was this belief that nations must westernize in order to advance. And you see this with Francis Fukuyama. You see this with a lot of liberals, like, oh, you guys want to modernize. You want to join us in the tech revolution. Well, to do that, you're going to have to westernize. To modernize is to westernize, which means you have to bring in property rights, individual rights, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, gay rights, all that stuff. They've been saying that for a long time. And essentially, to modernize, you must become secular liberals. And he says that's not the truth, because he says, this is the line that I love, as you westernize the rest of the world, the rest of the world defines what the West is, which is axiomatic. And I never thought of it like that before. But he says, what really actually happens is, as we've seen, people thought this is what would happen in like the 50s. As they adopt our Western techniques, they'll become more like us. They actually didn't. What he found is that cultural customs seem to maximize under modernization. Like you see this in China. It's like, okay, we will learn from the West. We'll take your techniques. We'll take your strategies, but we will use this to actually draw a deeper distinction between us. We'll actually maximize our cultural differences, which is, I mean, like you can just, follow the tactics of the West and not become like the West, and really just take them and use that to like become more like yourselves. And that's actually what they saw. And so, and then you end up with the modern situation. Well, what is the West then? Because we thought it was just these tactics and these beliefs, but no, it turns out you could have modern factories without human rights, right? It's called the Invariance Hypothesis in the book. The Invariance Hypothesis, in the early stages, modernization increases Westernization. In the later phases, modernization facilitates the rejection of Westernization. You actually give them the tools to more competently reject the West, which is the irony. If you kept them as peasants, you could have kept them under control, but you kind of give them the tools which define themselves to almost increase their nationalistic fervor and use that against you. And he says that, it's part of this civilizational model that the world is undergoing a process of indigenization. And they're adopting the Western tactics, but not Western attitudes. And so people are becoming more and more hostile to the West, while the West is having a crisis of defining itself. And that, I think, pretty well describes the situation we're in right now. And so that's where we have the East versus the West.
And the crucial central conflict, in many respects, it seems to me, in the coming years, will be between the West on the one hand and an Islamic Confucian coalition on the other. The action of this Islamic Confucian coalition, however, is, I think, only symptomatic of a general reaction against the West on the part of non-Western societies, as the West uses its international institutions it controls, its military power, and its economic resources to run the world in ways that will maintain Western predominance, protect Western interests, and promote Western political and economic values.
And we're going to talk about this when I speak with the interview. We're going to have him next with an individual, very popular individual named Endeavor. He's a Canadian man who lives in Russia. And I was asking him about, what's it like on the ground in Russia? How do they see you as Canadian, or do they see you as Western? And they say, practically they see me as Canadian, but outside of outside of the West, there's a very, and I've said this already, but there's a very strong conceptualization of what the West is. They know who is part of the West. Canada is part of the West, and they might be nice to you because, oh, you're Canadian, you're not American, but they kind of know you're from this broad sphere of influence, and they will treat you accordingly. Just as like we can look to the East, it's like, there is sort of this broad unity between the East, and even though there is some political differences, and like at the drop of a hat, China probably could, if it wanted to, take over a lot of the area and become this sort of Sinic empire. You could, and in a lot of ways, he had to stop that happening from the Middle East. That's the story of Gaddafi. He was on his way of trying to unite people, but that's what happens when you try to make your own fucking bank, right? And we know this practically because economic alliances make more sense between culturally similar areas or culturally related areas. Like we see the Scandinavia unite, we see the Baltic regions unite, and we see North America unite. But the problem is still like Mexico. Why is it so hard to, even though we've got NAFTA, it's like there's still these problems that make it harder to trade between Canada and the US and Mexico, because there is just this ethnic division there. It's kind of going away now, and we'll see where that goes. But really, there's, when people talk about friendshoring, there's this topic that comes up a lot in geopolitical circles called friendshoring. And that's the idea of the West, broadly, the Western Empire, taking back all of its manufacturing, taking it all back from China, taking it all back from these other areas, and maybe even Africa, wherever the fuck it was, and bringing it back to our allies, into our sphere of influence. But then, well, what is in our sphere of influence? And some people were saying, friendshoring is a good idea, bring manufacturing back. And I said, well, all that manufacturing is going to fucking Mexico. What does that mean for me? What does that mean for all the steel towns where we grew up? Does that mean manufacturing is coming back to America? Or does it mean manufacturing is coming back to the newest fringe frontier area that is part of the American empire called Mexico? And what we are actually starting to see is this sort of reformation of Mexico into something that could exist in the American empire. Maybe that takes 100 years, but maybe friendshoring is just, a power play to help like teach Mexico how to be Western, but it's not gonna help Canada. That's just one little prediction. We'll see. But for all the stories I'm hearing, that all the manufacturers go to this fucking Mexican place, and you have to ask why, right? And this is one of the reasons why certain, even economic unity between areas that are geographically close just don't seem to work. Like, for example, the East Asian Economic Caucus was a big project, and again, an obvious project. Like, why don't all these East Asian countries get together? But Japan just didn't want to join. And why didn't Japan want to join? Because Japan is this outlier. Japan is this fascinating case where it's a tiny island on the fringes of the Eurasian continent, but it is, for all intents and purposes, a core area. It is like France. It is culturally, religiously, ethnically distinct, and it can stand on its own. And it did. It fought off China, fought off Russia. It's got a lot of power there, and it just decided that it was not culturally similar enough to China, even though you would think so. But it's starting to get there. Another example was, for a while, Australia was trying to broker more deals with China. And they're like, look, we're right. There was a time where Australia was trying to break from the West because Australia is so far away, right? Australia, it's like, we want to stand on our own. So for us to stand on our own and achieve our sovereignty, we should have a better relationship with China and these East Asian countries. And it just never took off. And the reason he gave in the book was like, they just don't like Westerners. China doesn't like Australia. They don't like Australians. They think they're too loud. Yeah. They think they're weird. They don't have a lot in common. And frankly, there's this idea that a lot of capitalists have, that business is some universal language that everyone speaks. It's kind of the opposite. Like, business is very, very difficult to conduct with people who are not your own. Who don't like. It's very difficult for Westerners to conduct business in China, to the point where you need to like either like be there yourself or hire Chinese people to like translate not just the language but the cultural customs, right? It's not just that everyone learns the same business language. So it's like even in economic scenarios that would make sense, that would be mutually beneficial. There's no reason why Australia and China shouldn't have a trade agreement. It just always fucking falls apart. And the problem, that means it can't just be economic, and it can't just be geographic. It has to be this other civilizational essence that the oil and the water just don't mix. And what are we going to do about that? Whereas something like NATO or CARICOM, they're effective alliances because they're between Western nations. Even like these trade unions in the Caribbean, between Caribbean countries, they kind of work because they are Caribbean. But even like defensive alliances don't fail. That's why, like, even when we were talking about last episode, like these nations that could only momentarily unite against Russia. Like, why was Europe so at odds for so long? Because it had to like learn how to be a civilization. Only when Europe learned to be a civilization could it fight back against Russia. But you know, it's not obvious that if you are distinct enough cultures that you could even unite against a common foe for more than like one war, then you're immediately at war with each other again. And that's just how it is. And to the point being that that's why this BRICS thing, I don't know if that will work. And for people to know, BRICS, like, what is BRICS? That's India, that's Russia, that's China. It's this dream that if these, because India is like its own, they're different civilizations. Russian civilization, Chinese civilization, and Indian civilization. These are all distinct. And the idea that they could just like, why don't they just become like one entity? I always ask the same question. I asked this last time. Well, why didn't they? They've had all of human history to do it. They could do it right now. Why don't they? And really what we're trying to answer is why don't they? When everything else makes sense, when it would be militarily, economically, even culturally beneficial, why can't they do it? Well, this seems to be an answer that is they're just at civilizational odds. Sorry, did I cut you off there, or were you about to say something?
All I was going to say is it almost is like the exception that proves the rule, I guess, that BRICS exists because they're so different, and they would never, amalgamate into one civilization, obviously, because of that. But they will form these alliances to demonstrate their opposition or their position of like of weakness in relation to the Western
in reaction
Empire,
to the
right?
West. That's the only way they can ever work.
Right. So and it's like, and so like you can see it happening. Like BRICS only came about after the Second World War, after the Cold War, right? So the Cold War ends, America becomes the hegemon, and suddenly you have things like BRICS. So you have these people who never looked each other in the eye in 1,000 years suddenly are best trading buddies. So yeah, but that proves how different they are, right?
He's got this definition here of a torn civilization. And this is what I'd like to talk about before we got to end this. Because there's civilizations that once existed and no longer exist. And then there's some civilizations that seem like they're in the process of existing again. Like Turkey, like the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of Turkey. And Turkey is a fascinating example. There's a few key examples of what we call a torn civilization. Turkey is one. Mexico would be one. Russia would be one. A torn country requires... Basically, it's a civilization that once existed or can exist. So Turkey, its internal conflict is between whether it wants to become like a Western secular country. This is the revolutions of Ataturk to try and modernize it, or is it going to be an Islamic country? And this is sort of the internal conflict that's happening right now, and it doesn't know what it wants to be. Just like Japan for a period, like it goes through what type of people do you want to be? How modern do you want to be? And sometimes, like for example, Turkey, maybe the Islam takes over, or maybe it doesn't, but like it's torn between these two civilizations in the process of becoming, and one kind of has to win. And that's the same thing with Mexico. In Mexico, if you look at it, it's so conflicted because Mexico is in the process almost of becoming Mexico. Like it hasn't truly become what it's going to be yet. That's why it's so chaotic. And there's three components, he says, required for a torn civilization to re-civilize. The main two of them being that the elite have to be on board, and whatever like the host country is, because usually most of these countries, they're in the orbit of another civilization. Here's another one: Ukraine. What is Ukraine? Is Ukraine a nation of Ukrainians, or is it actually Russians? They can't agree. And we talked about that with the history of Ukraine. And I'm not trying to take a pro or anti-Ukrainian stance, but Ukraine is a nation in the process of becoming very, very messily. But you need like the elites of there to say, we want to be a nation. And this was what happened to Germany. We talked about this last episode. The German nationalist movement had the buy-in from the elites and the buy-in from the people. And most importantly, had the buy-in from Russia. You need the powerful countries around you to actually accept that you become a civilization again, and that's kind of where these torn countries are. And Germany kind of slipped through and tricked those around, and that was the German nationalist movement. But look what's happening in Ukraine. You've got two powerful core areas on either side of it who don't agree about what Ukraine should be, and Ukraine actually doesn't really have a say in it. That's what you're seeing there right now. You're actually the war in Ukraine that's currently going on is almost like every single war that's been in Ukraine, which is that it's caught between two civilizations on either side that can't agree on what it should be. And then I think that's a very, very interesting way of looking at it. Like a lot of these former civilizations, like the reason they're not allowed to be civilizations is because some bigger civilization says, I don't agree. I don't think you should be one yet. That's kind of what happened with Germany now. Like, Germany was literally partitioned between two great powers. Like, we're not going to let you be Germans anymore. And they're not allowed to be Germany anymore, but they're still there just because the Germans are so tough. But the memory of Germany is so strong, rather. And this is also why he says Islam struggles to be a civilization, because Islam, if you look at it, doesn't have a central core power. And every civilization, for a civilization to be a civilization, it needs a center of the power. So the center of the power in the Western, sphere of influence, obviously, would be America. I don't think a lot of people would really disagree with that. This core entity in the East would probably be China, not so much Japan. I think you make a better case for China now. The time of Japan's kind of over. The problem with the Middle East, even though Islam is so strong, even though Islam spreads so effectively, there actually is no core area of Islam. Now, there could have, at various points, it could have been Iran. Maybe it could have even been Iraq. There's been contenders for like a core area, but the problem is, for a civilization, it needs to have the core area. And if it doesn't, it kind of struggles to even exist. It can't coordinate itself really well. So Islam kind of spreads like a virus, but it can never be like a true caliphate. But imagine if it did. Imagine if it did have a core area, what that jihad might look like. It would be way, way, way more effective. But that's why, some people will try and define what a civilization is. It needs that core area that everything kind of orbits around. And in Europe, for a while, you could have made the argument in Europe it would have been Britain for a while, but what is the core area in Europe right now? Some people would lie and say, some people will say Germany, sure. But really, who controls Germany? Who controls Britain? It's pretty much America. Everyone knows that, right? So really, this whole theory is giving words to what everyone intuits every single day.
Which is that it's gay. It's the gay.
It is the gay.
It's the gay.
And that's why when people say, like, after the Cold War, why does NATO exist? NATO only exists to contain Russia. You see these broad geopolitical movements that suddenly make sense once you see. Now, and this is where some people might disagree with this whole premise that we are in a civilizational paradigm. But I think there's some truth to it. I don't think it supersedes heartland theory. I don't think it moves beyond the geographic realities. I think there's still, I don't think it really removes ideology from everything. And as we're going to get to next few episodes, how much more complicated this gets. But I do think it explains a lot about the world we're entering into. And I do think there's something to be said about the popularity of transnational identities gaining precedence over national identities. And that's important to think, because I do think, and we could end on this, and this will be a controversial statement, I think nationalism itself is falling out of favor. And maybe that's not controversial, maybe that's obvious, but, even as, for example, Canada, are we trying to redefine what it is to be a Canadian? Would we fight for Canada as a nation state? No. Would we fight for Canadians as an ethnic identity? Yes. Would that ethnic identity exist under the umbrella of sort of a broad whiteness? Yes. But what we're seeing in the West is fewer and fewer people who are willing to go to war for their nation states. There's fewer and fewer people who have trust or faith in their national infrastructure. And I think if you were to look around America right now, how many people are really willing to fight for the American empire writ large? Black people won't. Hispanics won't. They might say they will, but what they're fighting for is the space where they can be their ethnic identity. This is why the American identity has come to define just a space where your ethnicity is allowed to thrive, except if you're white. But there's so few people who would actually go to war to defend their state. So this idea of the nation state exists. It clearly it exists. Clearly it's still relevant, but we might be entering a more complicated world where the identities that we are willing to fight for are no longer nationalist identities. They are more broad reaching. And there's people on our side and the right who are poking around the edges of this problem, trying to define what are the limits of that, because they're not national borders.
They're client identities. Like there's a total division between like the ownership or the heritage of the empire and then the shareholders or like the stakeholders of the empire. You know what I mean? Like the people that are the current stakeholders are the ones that are requested to fight for it. It's not even really theirs. It's so strange.
Yeah. And this might be a problem that's more pronounced in North America, because we are not as old as a lot of these, Scandinavian countries that can trace their lineages back centuries and centuries. So it's a different problem. But I think even right now on the right, as we talk about this, we're trying to negotiate the place of like the colonies in a larger Anglo identity, which is in relation to, how does that relation fit to the European identity? Because we are aware it exists. And it doesn't seem that the things that people are willing to fight and die for are no longer nation states. And that's just from my perspective, but I think others would agree. Anyway, it's The Clash of Civilizations, Remaking of World Order. I recommend the book. There's a lot in here that I didn't get to talk about, but I hit the broad points that I wanted to. Did you have any sort of closing thoughts on that?
No, man, that's an interesting one for sure.
All right, we're going to revisit this as we go on to the next few episodes, because we're going to go dive deeper and deeper into this. But I think that sets up a good, nice pastiche of ideas. Anyway.
A pastiche.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
Cool, man. Bye. See ya.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.